This week's First Chapter Fridays is called The Barren Grounds by David Robertson. It's the first book in a series called the Mississauga Saga, and it's about two foster kids growing up in Winnipeg, Canada, who come from Indigenous families. And it kind of has this sort of, if you like the Chronicles of Narnia, and it has that feel to it, mixed in with some Indigenous mythology. So this is a fantasy book. If you like fantasy, you might like this story. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the book so you can get a feel for it. I want to point out that the beginning of this book has a map in it. I always consider it a really good sign when a book has a map in the beginning. Chapter 1. Morgan's head was pressed against her pillow. The alarm on her phone had just been snoozed again, and her plan to leave early for school was slipping away each time she reached forward with a groggy hand to silence the incessant beeping. Still, she refused to poke around the screen lower, where a simple touch would shut the alarm off permanently. She had good intentions to wake up, stay awake, and get out of bed. The thing was, it was so darn comfortable. A rhythmic, crunching sound replaced the alarm with this last strike of the snooze button, and a scene of a blizzard came into her mind. Morgan was walking through it, across a seemingly endless field. There was a square light in the distance, but she never got closer. When she tried to move faster, her body wouldn't allow it. She kept taking the same heavy steps that led nowhere, her feet crunching through the snow. Morgan tried to imagine something else. She should have been able to. It was not a dream. She knew she was awake. She pressed her eyelids shut so tightly that her entire face scrunched together like a raisin, to force something else to come into her mind, to force herself back to sleep and into an actual dream. But she couldn't get rid of the image, or the crunching. Then it dawned on her. The crunching sound had been in time with her heartbeat. With her ear pressed against the pillow, her pulse announced itself forcefully and unrelentingly. All she had to do was lift her head. It was a cosmic design to get her out of bed. Morgan kicked off her sheets like she was in a karate class, sat up, and the sound went away. She stayed like that for a minute, staring at the white walls, the blizzard stubbornly following her even now, until the alarm jolted her into movement. She silenced it again, then checked the time. Good, it was still early. Morgan set about the task of getting ready for school. After all, this had been the plan all along. Morgan's bedroom had a tall, narrow window that faced the street. Opposite the window, in the back corner, just above the floor and beside the headboard, were two pipes protruding from the wall. They were cut down, capped off, and out of the way. She guessed that her bedroom used to be a bathroom, but in the 2 months she'd been here, she had never bothered to ask, because the answer felt obvious. Where else would you stick the oldest foster kid? The room had thin carpeting that didn't quite match the hallway carpet, which made Morgan think that it had been purchased at a discount carpet store. She had hung clothing, mostly hoodies, on a series of hooks at the back of her door, and taped a modest collection of posters to the walls. Finally, there was a floating shelf for her books. Fantasy books, mostly. Old ones, because Morgan liked how books used to be written. She liked the worlds that authors imagined and how she could imagine herself in them. She would read books on her bed, facing the window. She'd lie on her stomach, kick her feet in the air, and get lost. Other times, she would just sneak up to the attic. There, she could really be alone, and she could really escape. Escaping was the plan this morning, not just into another world. Rather, Morgan intended to get out of the house and on her way to school solo. It would be a peaceful walk on her own for once, without Eli, the new foster kid. Over the last week, since he'd arrived at the house, it felt like she'd become a glorified babysitter, even though, at 12, Eli was only just a year younger than her. Morgan got dressed in ripped jeans, a white t-shirt, and a black hoodie, and tied her black hair into a loose ponytail. She pulled the door open in slow motion to prevent any squeaking from the hinges. Success. Halfway there. Now there was just a matter of the hallway. She took one soft step, then another, all without even a whisper of a sound. Morgan felt like a ninja. To her left was Eli's bedroom. She could see the mound of his body underneath the Star Wars comforter, Their foster parents had bought him prior to his arrival. The only personal touch in the room, and it wasn't even his. At least Morgan had her things on walls and hooks, and even clothes scattered on the floor. If Eli hadn't been sleeping in the bed right now, you'd never have known that somebody was living there. There was only Eli and the oversized drawing pad he brought everywhere, like Linus and his blanket. More ninja steps followed. The only thing that worried Morgan was Katie and James. Their bedroom was directly adjacent to the stairwell, as though they'd known beforehand that they'd have to contend with a teenage girl sneaking around. Luckily, the door to the stairwell was open. This meant all she needed to do was continue on her improbable run of silent steps. She could already picture herself walking to school alone. The sun would be shining, the grass emerald green, the birds chirping. There'd be no snowstorm, no square light in the distance that never got closer, no crunching footsteps. She was almost home free. She put her foot down quietly. If I did want to sneak out one night, I could totally do it, Morgan thought. She'd run away before, which wasn't quite the same as sneaking out. Not from Katie and James' place, but from her last foster home. More than once. That was what had brought her here. She took another step. Creak. Morgan stiffened. Maybe nobody would wake up. The peaceful, isolated walk to school could still happen, right? She wouldn't have to look back to ensure Eli was still with her, lugging that drawing pad with him. He was a small kid for his age, so the drawing pad looked comically big, wedged between his arm and his torso. She wouldn't have to try to make conversation with him, because he hadn't said much since arriving here. She could just put her earbuds in and take her time. "Morgan?" James asked from the bedroom. "Is that you?" Morgan sighed. Why did James have to have superhuman hearing? Yeah. On the plus side, at least now she could go back to sleep for an hour. So I said this was a fantasy book. It takes a couple chapters before you get to the fantasy part. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to chapter 5 and read you a little bit of where we're getting a little closer into that. Chapter 5. Morgan and Eli got home in record time, thanks in large part to Eli, who was walking faster than Morgan had ever seen. They didn't talk much. He couldn't wait to use the drawing pad, she could tell. As he walked, he checked every few seconds to make sure it was still snugly under his arm. He hadn't even asked Morgan where her secret hiding place was. And for a kid not to ask about a secret hiding place, well, his mind had to be somewhere else. It wasn't really a secret hiding place. It was more like a forbidden place. And even that made it sound more exotic than it really was. The attic was on the 3rd floor of the house. There was a flight of stairs that went halfway from the 2nd floor to a landing, followed by another flight of stairs that took you the rest of the way. "Here's the thing," Morgan said when they got home. "My secret hiding place is in the attic, and it's really just that we're not allowed up there. Has James had that talk with you yet? The do's and don'ts?" Eli shook his head. "Not yet." "He probably doesn't want to scare you off," she said. "In short, the attic's getting renovated into a family room or something, and because there's like a hazard everywhere you step, we're not allowed up there." "What kind of hazards?" he asked. "Never mind that," she brushed it off. "It's kind of like a curfew, you know? To be safe, you're supposed to come home before 8 o'clock at night. But what's really going to happen if you come home at 9? There aren't hazards, really." There actually were, but Morgan was of the opinion that once Eli was up there, he'd see that the benefits outweighed the risks. So what if there were nails on the ground and exposed wires? They were dead wires, so whatever. "So it's just an attic," Eli stated. James was a doctor, Katie a teacher, and neither of them got home until around 5 o'clock, often later, so Morgan knew she had plenty of time to show Eli what she meant. She started to lead him up the stairs. "Eli, you draw all those pictures with super pretty locations and walking animals, and it's all so magical and amazing, and yet—" She stopped for a moment with one more flight of stairs to go. "And yet you think an attic is just an attic?" Eli shrugged. They kept going, and soon were in the attic, looking out over its grandeur. "So it's just an attic," she said, repeating Eli's words and shaking her head. She gave him a nudge. "Come on." Morgan suspected that the large open room used to be 2 bedrooms. She'd arrived at the house with the attic in mid-construction, and 2 months later it was still in mid-construction. As far as she could remember, the construction guys had only been there twice. If they hadn't left their tool bags and some other equipment behind, you would never have guessed that they were doing work at all, or that they even existed. It was a skeleton of a room. There was plywood flooring throughout, mostly deconstructed walls with the electrical wires that had been cut off from their power source exposed, and scattered piles of debris waiting to be taken away. Sections of drywall, cut up pieces of plywood, light fixtures, nails, screws, wire, and broken glass. The only slightly curious thing about the attic, other than to imagine what the room might look like in a billion years when it was finally finished, was a painted-over door on the wall beside the stairs that, at some point, might have been a closet when the attic had bedrooms. There was definitely space behind the door for there to be something. It didn't open to the outside of the house or anything like that, but really, Morgan had no idea what that something could be. There were layers upon layers of paint. You couldn't even begin to see where the door ended and the door frame began. And it didn't seem like the renovation plans included any work on the door and whatever lay behind it. "So, where do you read and write and stuff?" Eli asked. "Ah," Morgan raised her index finger. "I was hoping you would ask that. Follow me, little one." "Hey." Eli's face scrunched up like he'd stuck a lemon in his mouth. "Sorry, you're not little. I was just being dramatic." "I am little, but you're making me feel weird about it." Morgan led Eli to the window that looked out over the street. The window, also, to this point, had been left mostly untouched. Only its frame had been stripped away. On the floor, in front of the window, there was a Morgan-shaped space cleared of any debris. "There's no electricity, so I use the flashlight on my cell, or the streetlight when my cell dies," Morgan explained. There was a book leaning against the wall under the window. Morgan picked it up, then lay down on her stomach exactly where she had lain down each night she'd come up here, safe from any hazard. She opened her book to the page she dog-eared and started reading. Every few lines, she looked to the side to check on Eli, who just stood there at first, looking out the window. But then he started to kick away debris to make a space for himself, and eventually he sat down beside Morgan. He flipped the drawing pad to its first page, opened his pencil case, and took out a pencil. Morgan smiled. She liked that this was no longer a place just for her. It was for both of them. She didn't remember much about the first foster home she'd been taken to, only that she'd felt very alone. Everything was so big, and she was so small. This was Eli's first foster home, and though he was much older than she had been, she could tell that he felt kind of the same thing, alone. Now maybe he wouldn't feel that way, not so much at least. After that, Morgan gave most of her attention to her book, and she could tell that Eli was giving his attention to the empty page in front of him, full of possibilities. For a good while, the only sound was the flip of the page. Morgan figured that Eli was taking his time, thinking of the perfect thing to draw for his first work of art in the new book. She bet that he felt the same excitement she felt on the first page of a novel, the prospect of a new world. Finally, out of the corner of her eye, she saw his pencil hit the blank white page, as white as the blizzard she pictured first thing that morning. As soon as it did, loose strands of hair swayed in front of her face. She blew them off to the side and kept reading. Moments later, her hair was in her face again. This time, she had felt a subtle breath cool against her skin. "Would you stop that?" she asked. "Stop what?" "Blowing on me, obviously." "It wasn't blowing on you," he said. "I'm just sketching something." Morgan peeked over at Eli's drawing and immediately forgot everything. It looked like he was creating some kind of a figure. Not a human, but something that walked on 2 legs. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Eli stared at it as though he hadn't just drawn it. "I don't know," he said. "I'm kind of just making it up, I guess." "Cool." She nodded her head, impressed. Even just the start of it was awesome. The first few pencil strokes he'd made to create the humanoid animal. It looked just as good as anything on the other drawing pad, the one involved in the hit and run. One last look, and she went back to reading. She got a lot more reading done when she was up there alone, she realized. But I, for sure, am earning some good karma, she thought. She hadn't got more than a line into reading when, again, cool air rushed against her cheek, this time stronger than before. "Okay," Morgan slapped her book shut and slammed it against the floor. A cloud of dust erupted from the plywood and danced in the darkening light. I was cool with it. Now I'm not. Eli dropped his pencil as if it were burning his skin. I'm just this close, Morgan pinched her index fingertip perilously close to her thumb, to revoking your secret room privileges, Eli, I swear. I felt that, he whispered. Yeah. Morgan pushed herself up into a sitting position and threw her arms in the air. No kidding. You're blowing on me, and it's creepy. I'm not blowing on you, Eli said, his voice trance-like. You're not blowing on me, Morgan stated. Then what's blowing on me? It came from your general direction. The attic isn't haunted. My paper did it. Morgan stared at Eli, and the room was dead quiet until she burst into laughter. Eli, however, was not laughing at all. Eli, your paper did it? She could barely get the words out. I'm not lying. The more Eli sat there, staring at Morgan stone-faced, the less she felt like laughing. She caught her breath. There's probably a draft or something, she said. It went across your paper, hit me in the face. I swear, though, if you're doing it, don't. It came from my paper, he said deliberately. Something about the way he said it made her reconsider his claim, even though it was just about the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. More ridiculous than her daydream about Emily stealing Eli's drawing pad. Okay, she said, do it again. Eli hesitated. He reached for the pencil a few times before finally picking it up. He let the tip of it hover over the paper, ready to draw. The pencil was a millimeter from the white surface when Morgan heard the successive beeps that always rang out when the front door opened. Kids, Katie called, all the way from the first floor. Come down for dinner. I got takeout. Eli pulled the pencil away from his drawing pad and slipped it back inside its case. To be continued, Morgan said.